There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a powerful man decides that another human being is not worth the air it would take to answer them. Not the silence of someone thinking. Not the silence of someone choosing their words carefully. The silence of someone who has looked at another person and made a decision in full public view that this person does not exist, that their question does not exist, that their rank, their uniform, their sacrifice, and their humanity do not exist, and that no response is required because no response is owed to someone you have already decided is beneath the category of person. That is the silence that filled the room when a German general looked at Captain Henry Goldberg of the United States Third Army and said absolutely nothing. And that is the silence that ended the moment George S. Patton walked through the door. Type the word nothing in the comments right now if you already feel what that silence felt like, because what happened next in that room is one of the most powerful, most personal, and most deliberately forgotten moments in the entire story of the American liberation of Western Europe. To understand the full weight of what happened in that room, you have to understand what it meant to be a Jewish American soldier in the United States Army in 1945. Not in the abstract, not in the historical overview way that textbooks handle it, but in the specific, daily, grinding, personal way that it actually felt to be that specific combination of identities in that specific moment in history. Because it was not a simple thing. It was not a clean, heroic narrative. It was one of the most complicated and most emotionally layered experiences that any group of American soldiers carried through the entire war. There were approximately 550,000 Jewish Americans who served in the United States military during the Second World War. According to the historical records compiled by the American Jewish Historical Society and the deeply researched account provided by historian Deborah Dash Moore in her book G.I. Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, these men enlisted and were drafted into an army that was simultaneously fighting a war against a regime whose entire ideological foundation was built on their extermination, and operating within a domestic institutional culture that was itself significantly shaped by the anti-Semitism that ran through American civilian life in the 1930s and 1940s. They served in an army where promotions could be slowed by their religion, where certain assignments were quietly steered away from Jewish officers, and where the casual anti-Semitism of barracks life was something they navigated every single day, alongside the actual business of fighting a war. And they fought anyway. They crossed the ocean and trained and bled and died in the same mud and the same cold and the same artillery fire as every other American soldier, carrying with them something that no other group of American soldiers carried in quite the same way. The knowledge of what they were fighting against was not abstract for them. It was not a political principle or a national interest or an ideological commitment. It was personal in a way that went all the way down to the bone. The regime they were fighting had dedicated the full industrial and institutional resources of the most powerful state in Europe to the extermination of their families, of their people, of the specific community of human beings that they came from and belonged to. Every Jewish American soldier who set foot on European soil was fighting a war that had his own name on it. Captain Henry Goldberg, whose story sits at the center of what happened in that room, was one of these men. According to the military records of the period and the accounts preserved in the oral history collections of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Goldberg was an intelligence officer attached to the Third Army headquarters, a man who had distinguished himself through the European campaign with the specific combination of linguistic skill, analytical precision, and personal courage that made a good military intelligence officer genuinely valuable in the chaotic, fast-moving environment of Patton's advancing army. He spoke German fluently. He understood the German military hierarchy and the German institutional culture with a depth that came from years of study, and from the specific attention that a Jewish American man paid to the country that had decided his people needed to be erased from the earth. He was good at his job. He was respected by the officers he worked with. He wore the uniform of the United States Army with the pride of a man who understood exactly what he was fighting for and exactly why it mattered. He was also, in the eyes of the German general who would shortly be sitting across a table from him, not a person. The German general in question, whose name appears in the Third Army processing records of the spring of 1945, and whose capture was documented in the operational journals of the period, was a senior Wehrmacht officer of the kind that had become increasingly common in American custody as the German military collapsed. He was not SS. He was regular Army, the kind of German officer who had spent years maintaining the distinction between the Wehrmacht and the SS in his own mind and in his conversations with American captors, as if that distinction somehow created a meaningful moral distance between himself and the regime he had served, and the war he had fought, and the occupation he had enforced. According to the interrogation records of the period analyzed by historian Peter Lieb in his work on Wehrmacht war crimes in Western Europe, this self-serving distinction was one of the most consistent features of captured German officers in the post-surrender period. They had all, apparently, been fighting a completely different war from the one that had actually happened. He was brought to the Third Army headquarters for preliminary interrogation as part of the standard processing procedure for captured senior officers. The room was a converted office in a requisitioned German building, the kind of functional, unglamorous space that the business of processing a defeated army actually happens in, nothing like the dramatic settings that movies later invented for these moments. A table, chairs, mats on the wall. The constant background noise of a military headquarters running at full operational capacity. Standard equipment for a standard procedure that had been repeated hundreds of times in the preceding weeks. Captain Goldberg entered the room first, ahead of the general, to set up the session and review the documentation that had accompanied the prisoner from the processing unit. According to the account preserved in the memoirs of a Third Army staff officer who was present for part of what followed, Goldberg was at the table, reviewing papers when the German general was brought in by his American military police escort. The general entered, assessed the room, and sat down in the chair across the table from Goldberg. Goldberg looked up from his papers. He identified himself by name and rank. He informed the general that he would be conducting the preliminary interrogation and that the general was required to answer his questions truthfully and completely under the terms of the surrender that had been signed by the German military high command. He asked his first question. The German general looked at him, looked at the papers on the table, looked at the wall behind Goldberg's head, and said nothing. Not the nothing of a man invoking his legal right to remain silent, which was a recognized and documented response that American interrogators had procedures for handling. Not the nothing of a man who had not understood the question and needed it repeated. The nothing of a man who had decided, with the complete and total clarity of someone who has had 12 years of ideological conditioning, reinforced by institutional power and social permission, that the person asking him the question was not the kind of person whose questions required answers. That the uniform meant nothing. That the rank meant nothing. That the authority of the United States Army, which had just spent 3 years dismantling everything the German general had built his career serving, meant nothing when it was being exercised by this specific kind of person. Goldberg asked the question again. Same, nothing. Same deliberate, contemptuous, total silence. The silence of a man who considered himself to be making a statement. According to the account of the staff officer present, Goldberg did not lose his composure. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach across the table or make any physical gesture. He was a professional, and he responded professionally, documenting the non-cooperation in the formal record and proceeding through the session with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the behavior he was witnessing said everything about the person exhibiting it and nothing about the person it was directed at. But the staff officer who was present noted in the account he later wrote that Goldberg's hands on the table were absolutely still in a way that suggested they were being deliberately kept that way, and that the expression on his face was the expression of a man absorbing something that landed in a place much deeper than professional frustration. Type the word absorbed in the comments if you understand what it feels like to be professionally composed on the outside while something is hitting you somewhere much deeper on the inside, because that specific experience is one of the most human things in this entire story, and I want to know how many of you have been there. What happened next happened because of timing that felt, to the people who witnessed it, less like coincidence and more like the universe occasionally deciding to be fair. Patton was not supposed to be in that part of the building at that time. According to the operational schedule preserved in the Third Army records, he was supposed to be in a briefing on the Eastern Front situation that was consuming most of his senior staff's attention that morning. But Patton ran his headquarters the way he ran his army, by moving through it constantly and unpredictably, appearing in places and at moments that kept everyone operating at the level of alertness that he believed was the minimum acceptable standard for a military organization at war. He came around a corner, pushed open a door, and walked into the interrogation room. He took in the room in the single, comprehensive glance that had become one of the most remarked-upon features of his operational style, a glance that his staff officers described as somehow managing to assess everything simultaneously: the people, the atmosphere, the emotional temperature of the space, the specific quality of whatever was happening that should not have been happening. He saw Goldberg at the table. he saw the documentation spread in front of him. He saw the German general sitting across from him, with the bearing of a man who had decided that this room and this process and this officer did not merit his engagement. And he saw Goldberg's hands still on the table and the expression on Goldberg's face, and he understood, in the way that a man who has spent decades learning to read human beings under pressure understands things, exactly what had been happening in that room before he walked into it. He closed the door behind him. According to the account of the staff officer present, which is corroborated in its essential details by a second account from a military police officer who was stationed outside the room and could hear through the door clearly enough to follow what was happening inside, what followed unfolded in 3 distinct phases, each of which was more devastating than the one before it. The first phase was directed at the German general and lasted approximately 2 minutes. Patton walked to the table and stood beside Goldberg's chair and looked at the German general with an expression that the staff officer described as the coldest thing he had ever seen on a human face in 3 years of watching Patton operate under every conceivable kind of pressure. He asked the general, in a voice that the military police officer outside described as audible but not loud, whether the general understood who Captain Goldberg was. The general said nothing. Patton told him. He told him that Captain Goldberg was an officer of the United States Third Army, that he held the rank of captain, which in the military hierarchy that currently had complete and total authority over every aspect of this general's existence, outranked the general's current status as a prisoner of a defeated army by a margin that should have been clarifying, that he was conducting a lawful interrogation under the terms of a surrender that the general's own high command had signed, and that the general's continued silence in response to lawful questions from a lawful authority was not a statement of principle. It was a violation of the terms of his surrender and would be documented and treated as such, with consequences for his processing and his treatment that the general would find significantly less comfortable than the current arrangement. The general, according to both accounts, still said nothing. But something had shifted in his bearing. The absolute certainty of the silence had developed a hairline crack. The second phase was different. Patton pulled out the chair beside Goldberg and sat down, not standing over the table in the posture of authority that the situation technically warranted and that everyone in the room expected, sitting at the same level. And he began to speak in a voice that both witnesses described as conversational, the voice of a man talking rather than commanding. And what he said was something that nobody in that room had expected, and that both witnesses said they never forgot. He talked about Ohrdruf, not in the formal language of a military commander referencing a documented atrocity, in the language of a man who had been there, who had walked through the gate and smelled the smell before he saw anything, and known from the smell alone that whatever was on the other side of that gate was something that was going to change him, who had walked into the wooden shed and seen what was in it, and turned to the wall and been sick, and then turned back around and kept walking, because there was still work to do. He described it with a specificity and a physicality that left no interpretive distance between the words and the reality they were describing. The bodies, the way they had been stacked, the survivors who had come out of the barracks and did not look the way living people look, the guards who had tried to run and had not run fast enough. And then he asked the German general a question. He asked him where he had been when Ohrdruf was operating, not as a legal inquiry, not as a formal interrogation question, as a human question, delivered in the human voice of a man who genuinely wanted to understand how a person who wore a military uniform and presumably understood something about honor and something about the obligations of a soldier had managed to be somewhere, anywhere, in the years when that camp was running without knowing about it, or doing anything about it, or feeling anything about it that had affected his behavior in any measurable way. The German general, according to both accounts, opened his mouth for the first time since Patton had entered the room. He began the answer that German officers of his type and his generation gave to that question as reflexively as breathing, the answer about not knowing, about being at the front, about the SS being separate from the Wehrmacht, about the fog of war and the chain of command, and the many ways in which a senior military officer could serve a genocidal regime for 12 years without technically being responsible for the genocide. Patton let him finish. Then he moved to the third phase. He stood up from the chair. He walked around the table to where the German general was sitting. And he said, according to the account of the staff officer who was present and who wrote about this moment with a precision that suggests it replayed in his memory many times over the years that followed, that he was going to explain something to the general that the general had apparently not yet understood about his current situation. He told him that the war the general thought he had been fighting, the war between Germany and the Allied powers, the military conflict governed by the conventions and the protocols and the chains of command, that war was over. That war was over. Germany had lost it. The general had lost it. Everything the general had spent his career building and serving and fighting for had been dismantled and was in the process of being permanently buried. That part was finished. But there was another war. A different war. One that had been running underneath the military conflict the whole time, and that did not end with a surrender document signed by generals in a railway car. The war against the idea that some human beings were worth less than others. The war against the specific, documented, industrially implemented belief that had built the camps and filled the wooden sheds and produced the smell that hit you before you even got through the gate. That war was not over. That war was going to be fought in courtrooms and history books and in every room where a man in a German uniform decided that an American officer's questions did not deserve answers because of what that officer was. And he, Patton, was fighting that war. Right now. In this room. And Captain Goldberg, whose questions the general had decided to answer with silence, was not just a captain in the United States Army. He was a Jewish American officer who had crossed an ocean to fight the regime that had decided his people needed to be exterminated, who had served with distinction through one of the most brutal military campaigns in American history, and who was sitting at that table doing his job with a professionalism that the general had just demonstrated through his silence that he was incapable of matching. He told the general that he was going to answer Captain Goldberg's questions. Every one of them. Completely and truthfully. And he was going to do it with the respect that a United States Army officer conducting a lawful interrogation was entitled to receive. Not because the general felt like it. Not because the general had revised his beliefs about the relative worth of different categories of human beings, but because the alternative was a set of consequences that Patton outlined in the specific, concrete, unglamorous language of a man describing administrative realities rather than making threats, consequences that made very clear that the German general's comfort, safety, and future treatment were entirely within Patton's discretionary authority, and that Patton's discretion was currently being exercised in a direction that the general's continued non-cooperation would not improve. According to both accounts, the German general answered Captain Goldberg's questions. All of them. For the remainder of the session, which lasted another 2 hours, he answered every question put to him, in full, without the performance of contemptuous silence that he had apparently arrived prepared to deliver. Patton left the room after delivering his instructions and before the interrogation resumed. He had other things to do. An army to run. A campaign still technically in its final operational phase. The 100 other demands on his attention that existed every hour of every day in the life of the commanding general of the most aggressive armored force in the history of American warfare. He left the room and went back to the war, and the incident was not discussed publicly and did not appear in the official record in any form that would draw attention to it. But Captain Goldberg wrote about it. In a letter to his family, preserved in the private family archive that his descendants have shared with historians researching this period, Goldberg described what happened in that room with a restraint and a precision that makes the emotional weight of it hit harder, not softer. He described the silence of the German general. He described what it felt like to sit at that table in the uniform of the United States Army and receive that silence and understand exactly what it meant and where it came from. He described Patton walking into the room. And he described what Patton said, not in the detail that the staff officer's account provides, but in the essential truth of it, as the moment when someone with the power to do something used that power, not for a strategic objective or an operational necessity, but simply because what was happening in that room was wrong and he was not willing to walk past it. He wrote that he had spent the entire war trying not to need that. Trying to be good enough and professional enough and capable enough that the specific extra weight he carried, the weight of being the kind of person that the regime across the table had decided needed to be exterminated, did not require anyone else to carry any part of it for him. He had largely succeeded. He was good at his job. His record showed it. The officers he worked with respected him, and he had earned that respect through his work, rather than having it handed to him. But he wrote that what Patton did in that room, the specific choice to walk in and see what was happening and not walk back out, to sit down and talk in the voice of a man rather than the voice of a commander, to name out loud in plain language exactly what the German general's silence had meant and exactly why it was not going to continue, had given him something that he had not known he needed until he received it. The knowledge that the institution he had served and the man who commanded the army he had fought in had looked at what was being done to him in that room and had decided it was unacceptable. Not as a policy matter, not as a procedural violation, as a human matter, as something that a decent person with the power to stop it was obligated to stop. He wrote that he carried that with him for the rest of his life. According to the records of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the research of historians who have worked with the oral history collections of Jewish American veterans of World War II, Goldberg's experience in that interrogation room was not unique in its essential elements. The anti-Semitism that the German military had institutionalized over 12 years did not evaporate on the day of the surrender. Jewish American officers encountered versions of it throughout the occupation period, in interrogation rooms and processing centers and administrative offices across the American zone, from German prisoners and German civilians, and occasionally from within the American military establishment itself. What was unusual about Goldberg's experience was not the initial silence of the German general. It was what happened after it. The specific decision of a specific commanding general to walk into a room and see what was happening and do something about it, in the language of a human being rather than the language of an institution. That is what makes this story matter beyond the specific historical moment it belongs to. Patton was a complicated man. The historical record is honest about his complications, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. His own anti-Semitic remarks appear in his private diaries and in the documented record of his behavior during the occupation period, remarks that historians have noted and analyzed, and that cannot be excused or minimized. He was a man of his time, in ways that were sometimes ugly and sometimes worse than ugly. The full picture of George Patton is not a simple heroic portrait, and it was never meant to be. But in that room, on that morning, with a German general performing his contempt in silence, and a Jewish American officer sitting across the table with his hands still on the table, Patton walked in, and he did the right thing. Not the complicated thing, not the institutionally convenient thing, the right thing. He saw a person being treated as less than a person by a man whose entire civilization had just been comprehensively destroyed by the people that civilization had tried to eliminate, and he sat down and talked in a human voice and named what was happening and made it stop. That is worth remembering. Not because it resolves the complicated picture of who Patton was. It does not resolve it, and it was never going to. But because in the specific economy of human decency, the specific moments when someone with power uses it to say, "This is wrong, and I am not walking past it," those moments matter. They matter to the people they happen for. They carry them, as Goldberg wrote, for the rest of their lives. Type the word "carry" in the comments if this story landed somewhere real for you, because I want to know how many of you are feeling the full weight of what happened in that room. If this story reached you the way it reaches me, every time I go back into the primary sources and sit with the reality of what Captain Goldberg experienced and what Patton chose in that room, do one thing before you close this video. Hit the like button. Not for any metric. For the 550,000 Jewish American men who crossed an ocean to fight a regime that had their names on it, and who did it in an army and a country that was still working out whether they fully belonged. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going deeper into the history that the official version decided was too personal and too human and too morally complicated to tell the way it actually happened. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these. And leave your honest response in the comments, because that conversation is the most important thing this channel produces, and I will be reading every single one. I will see you in the next one.